Hello, everyone. It's really nice to see you. Yes, I'm working as a senior consultant for IMA International, as Jorge said, a training and consultancy company. And my interest is specifically in KM, is working with people and accompanying them through KM processes. That could be strategizing, it could be thinking through their knowledge management options, it could be facilitating, workshops. So there's a range of things. And I've been lucky enough, together with my colleague, Ruth Jolly, who also co-wrote the article with me on KM for Dev, about measuring KM, we've really had a wide experience and a wide exposure to different types of organizations. That's why it's interesting to see who's present today. So there's a number of you, there's a majority of NGOs just today on this webinar for 1 hour, but I mean, there's a mix, obviously it's going to be different every time. And it's really interesting seeing similar issues crop up, no matter whether you're working for a big or small NGO or for a government sector or for private or academia, really. There's a lot of commonality. So that's really interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit about a few key points that link KM and learning, and it's going to be building on what we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Those of you who were in the webinar when we were in 4 breakout rooms thinking about organizational learning and KM, and also building on Helen's presentation of last week, where she talked about EFAD and how they were recently strategizing for KM within the organization. So just another quick poll before we start. Can you put your hand up, either physically or with the little hand at the bottom under reactions, if you think that your organization is a learning organization? Can you put your hand up? Let's have a look. Oh, no. A few, not very many, are we? We're being super honest. Okay. Okay, this is, yeah, this is, okay. Oh yeah, okay, waving. Yeah, all right. Okay, it was just as a quick poll, just to have an idea. Obviously, we have different interpretations of learning. I'm just going to run through a few little slides, and hopefully you'll hear my voice. There we go. Hopefully that should be okay. Jorge, tell me if it's not working. Huh? Okay, so just as a thought, so really linking linking KM and organizational learning. Now, organizational learning has been around for a long time. At least for 20 years. So specifically in the NGO sector, some of you could remember Bruce Britton, the Learning NGO, as a collaborative exercise, developing a learning framework. At the same time, in the private sector, you were having, the capture and generation of knowledge happening, and that being frameworks and models coming out of there. So there, the word wasn't so much learning, but there was different interpretations. So what's really interesting is looking at the link, which remains, and continues. I just come from a premise, and this is what we that's our position at IMA, if you like, on knowledge management, which is that KM is really a means to an end. In other words, we're investing in knowledge management to be able to improve whatever the mandate or work of your organization is, no matter what it is. So KM is really a way to get there, yeah? A way of improving. And obviously, whatever organization you work for, you want to remain relevant and grow and evolve and innovate, yeah, to be able to maintain and continue to grow and render service. So as part of that, organizations obviously need to learn, and learning internally from what's happening inside of themselves, as well as externally from others. So that's a really key issue, and that continues, no matter what the organizational type is. So it's really important to be thinking about this learning aspect. And the other point to mention is that actually organizations are made up of people. I mean, it sounds really obvious, but we tend to forget that. We tend to talk about organizations as things. And therefore, when we talk about organizational learning, it's almost like, oh, there's a machine out there, some mechanism that's doing it. And what we have to think about is the people. And again, when we talk about KM, and obviously we're talking about conversions, knowledge conversions, and the one that's talked about most is the tacit to explicit. Again, the tacit is here in our heads, yeah, in people's heads. So all of this is just a little reminder to ground our feet and to think, actually, we're talking about people, okay? So whether you're coming from a learning lens or a KM lens or whatever, it's the people that you've got to focus on. At least that's, my, perception. So just as a few key points, I actually wanted to talk about when we were discussing with Jorge and Rocio the topics to cover, just 4, there are many obviously, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about these 4 things because I think they're really helpful in promoting organizational learning, okay? So how to make a case for KM, identifying barriers and then thinking of how to address them, as a way of strategizing, the importance of feedback, a really broad notion of feedback, and actually looking at what currently exists. What are your learning opportunities? What are your knowledge sharing opportunities already out there before you start thinking of something new? So let's go straight in. Number one, this is really straightforward. Obviously, when you're trying to promote KM, and some of us have an uphill struggle for this, some of us don't, it depends. Every organizational context is different. You've got to be a champion, an advocate. You have to convince others. You can't do it by yourself. You're going to need a network of supporters. And one way of really, really becoming an advocate is to articulate the costs of not doing KM and the benefits of doing it. And this is really quite important because different people hear different things. And when you're going to push and promote KM, you're going to need to talk at all of those levels. And so, whether you talk about, some people are more likely to hear the costs, that'll resonate with them. So, duplication, not working efficiently, working in silos, people demotivated, all of those costs that you can have if you're not doing KM properly. Some people will hear that message. If you want to push the benefits, the more effective, being more effective, efficient, having impact at scale, working cross-culturally and cross-sectionally, maximizing organizational links. There's lots of different benefits. They're kind of the flip side of each other. But it's really, really important to really identify them first and then be able to articulate them properly as part of your argument. And of course, because we said KM and learning are really about people, you've got to go and talk about this one, what's in it for me? We've talked about that, last week and the week before. If you can't convince someone or show someone that there's something in it for them, they won't do it. They won't join you in it. They won't change. They won't take up that new tool, whatever it is you want them to do. So the what's in it for me, that question, and being able to put yourself in people's shoes and empathize and really think of those arguments, that's really important. So that's part of making a case. So first of all, you've got to make a case for KM, in whichever way you're going to do it. And these are just some ideas. And number two, one way of strategizing is to look at barriers, look at what's not working, what are the issues. So here, barriers to KM environment, you can have different types of barriers. These are just 5 categories. There may be other ways of classifying. But again, it's quite a useful exercise to identify what are the hurdles, what are the challenges, what are the barriers under each of these categories within your own organization at this moment in time. And that will differ, yeah? And then you don't just dwell in that negative state. The idea is to identify these, the barriers, to then be able to do something about them. And you may not be able to act on them all in one go. So the idea is that actually what you want to be doing is be quite good at being able to read your organizational culture and the behavior, and then identify a discussion, have a discussion with key people that you're working with and identify what are really the top barriers. If you were able to address a few of these key issues, because nobody has the time and resources and possibility to address all of our barriers at any moment in time, you'll have to prioritize. So if you can identify what are the top 2 or 3, that if you address those, made a change there, that would really trigger change. That would enable, more positive knowledge sharing, So it's really thinking about prioritizing and then thinking about identifying what we call specific actionable recommendations. In other words, having thought of what your priority areas are, don't just think, oh, well, everyone understands, I'll just do some knowledge sharing activity. That's not specific enough. That's not really an action. So what you need to really kind of articulate and really, distill in your own mind and be able to share that with others and agree it is what are some real actionable recommendations, because that's going to help you move forward. And it's quite a skill to be able to do that, to be able to identify those and clarify those so that everyone can understand what you mean as well. So that's one way of strategizing, in a way, looking at barriers and thinking how to move forward from them. Just taking you a bit further is the role of feedback. And this is really important because, many people think of, what we mean by feedback can be quite a narrow interpretation. This is not just your personal, appraisal feedback from your line manager sort of thing. We're talking about feedback in its broadest sense. And we're talking about, if we think of organizations as systems, as complex adaptive systems, where a whole organization needs to hear, the system needs to hear from itself. So one individual can affect, the actions of one individual can affect the whole, and the whole can affect one individual. If you can visualize and conceptualize of organizations that way, you can actually see connections much more. And what it makes you realize is the importance of feedback, the importance of real-time, live feedback between all of these connections, yeah? Because that really supports what we call the supply and demand dynamic. You know, often when we talk about knowledge management, it's about some people who know or who have the expertise and some people who need to have it for their future job, role, task, and bringing that, you know, demand and supply together in a facilitated way in some way. You know, you can have tools such as peer assist for that, but it's all about importance of feedback. And you know, I would advocate, if you can, thinking of feedback really broadly and thinking about having your antenna up, you know, and really capturing all these signals that are out there, not just your monitoring system, not just your evaluation at the end of 3-year project, you know, live, real time, and the formal ones as well as the informal ones. So that's really quite important to work with that. And then here we go, 4th one. This one is just thinking about existing opportunities for learning and sharing. So it's really important to be able to look at your current practice, your current organizational life, everyday life, and think about the formal processes that occur, the formal mechanisms and structures that you have, you know, your project cycles, your work streams, the way your teams operate, the informal life where you all gather, well, when we were back in our offices, when we gathered at the coffee machine, yeah, but not now, but, you know, it's different ways, you know, all those elements, the informal life, the external links, all of that is really, really important. And thinking about, this is quite a useful exercise for anybody, thinking about what are the opportunities for learning that already exist in the current everyday life of your organization. You may not call them opportunities for learning. You may not even think of them in that way, but they actually are, in effect, because they're bringing people together in some way and they're opening a space which potentially is an opportunity for learning. So you could kind of reflect back on that and think, how can I tweak some of these? How can we maximize some of these? How can we really leverage them and make the most of it? So that we're not coming in with a whole new suitcase of like change management. You have to do this new thing. But actually, we're saying to people, you know what? That Monday meeting that we always have, what about if we slightly change the agenda? And that's a much easier way of getting buy-in and getting people to you know, move forward with changes. So these are different ideas, and this links back to your strategizing. So Helen talked really eloquently about all the process that they went through at EFAD last week for strategizing. So there's different ways of strategizing, whether you develop a KM strategy on paper, a document or not. But these are just different ways of supporting you and bringing in that learning, which is always there, which is foundational, obviously, because without that, we don't move forward. So that was a quick run through. There's more information here on IMA and on the online course. That's at the end of the presentation.